LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is James Tunney, who joins me to discuss his book, AI Post-Humanism, a cryptic soap opera. Beyond even transhumanism, post-humanism seeks to eradicate the human being as we know it. Where transhumanism advocates augmentation and enhancement of the mind and body, post-humanism aims to replace humans completely, reducing the population of natural biological specimens as various forms of artificial intelligence take over. The signs of this transformation can be seen everywhere, from the war on the family unit to dependence by design on franken-foods and pharmaceuticals, and from the promotion of suicide, the so-called right to die, and the undermining of social and cultural mores, gender, and even biological reality. Meanwhile, the boundary between fantasy and reality continues to blur as more and more of us live virtual lives surrounded by AI deepfake deceptions. Will we really be the architects of our own extinction? Hello and welcome, James, and thank you so much for joining us once again on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Always a pleasure, Greg, and thanks for the opportunity. As always, thank you.
James, today we're going to be having a discussion based around your latest book, which is entitled AI Post-Humanism, a cryptic soap opera. Now, as we have done the last couple of times we've spoken, we're going to dispense with a personal biography for yourself, your background, details of your work. All of that can easily be found within the body of the previous talks that we've done. Listeners, if this is the first time they've heard you speak, they can find links to all of that on the LegalizeFreedom.com page for this one. They're all there. Dip in and out as they like. Information about you is there, not least links through to your own website. Now, post-humanism in the title of your latest book, I think what we should dive in with is talking about transhumanism and post-humanism as not being interchangeable. If listeners got no ideas what either of those terms mean, I think you need to rewind a little bit, back up and check out some of our previous chats. But the idea here in the circumstances we find ourselves living in the current age and where trends in society and culture and technology are headed, it's going to be worth coming to understand some of these trends in a deeper way, because superficially it doesn't make sense. But when we look at transhumanism and posthumanism, the ethos behind those, what's driving them, it starts to make a bit more sense. So perhaps the first thing for you to get into is just mentioning the difference. That transhumanism is merely a transitional step. The clue's in the title. Posthumanism, anything like postmodernism, is the end game, the end goal, whatever that looks like.
Many posthumanists distinguish themselves from transhumanists, and they say, well, we're not like transhumanists, we're different. And then within posthumanism, there's different emphasis. So in many senses, as you've suggested, transhumanism suggests a transitional phase. And if we remember that transhumanism came from humanism, it was humanists that began to talk about transhumanism, and particularly Julian Huxley, who got prizes for being a great humanist. There's another thing we have to come back to. So transhumanism, as I have defined it, is really about where you're altering the human body and mind with some prosthesis, by some enhancement, by some mechanical addition to the body. And in many senses, the people that are arguing for transhumanism are arguing for their own individual right to change and modify their body. So, as I've said before, I don't care what people do to their body, and particularly we can see in the context of medical context that there's a justification, a good justification for people to be able to restore legitimate expectations. But for the transhumanists, the really embedded transhumanists want to be able to prolong their life, attain some immortality if they can, and be able to modify their body, for example, to be able to live in space and those ideas. But to a large extent, that's associated with the individual. So I have criticized what I call network transhumanism, which would be a phase where you are forced and compelled collectively to join up with the networks. So the same objective notionally of an enhancement of the body would draw you into the system. But post-humanism is really a commitment to move beyond the human and humanism. Now, there are different streams in it, and there are some post-humanists say, well, I don't believe in that. But really, we can think of it as, philosophically, it's post-humanism, meaning a rejection of the humanism that they see as very damaging. They say, well, humanism was very Eurocentric, male-centric, all this kind of stuff, colonial. And they also go so far as to say there's never anything really that we can define as the human, that the definition of the human was always changing. There's a lot of arguments that I argue are spurious. But what we have in particular in one stream, in the central stream of post-humanism, which I identify as AI post-humanism to really define it, is the idea that the human race is moving towards a phase where it is no longer human. And it is doing so by effectively breaking down all the borders into the body so that the human is not a self-contained unit. And obviously, this is done through the telecommunications network, through our brain-computer interface, all these ideas we've talked about before. So while there is a philosophical idea which suggests that post-humanism is there to correct humanism by recognizing the rights of animals and insects and the material world and the context and the reality of the material world, really at its center, I believe, is this Promethean drive to end humanity, to transform humanity, to integrate it into the machine. And that goes back in particular to the theorists that we've talked about in the 1920s in Britain as the empire changed, the empire of scientism, and then we might call it or as Churchill called it, the empire of the future, the empire of the mind. And I had a kind of regime of the made mind as I've described it. And that was the idea, which I believe is inherent in what global governance is about, is that the attainment of global government is not just to attain power. It's to transform the human species into something else. It's clear in the work of Haldane, Bernal, the Huxleys, Julian and his brother and half-brother, that it was about this continuation of the eugenicist movement. So I've argued that the greatest game that's going on, we're in a game, and the greatest game is the control of your consciousness. This will not merely be through neuro warfare and control of your perception of reality. It will actually be through control of your neurons, through your mind. And that is the idea, or that's part of the idea of, well, two things: integrating humans and also creating a new life form. Some people refer to this as God. They're openly speaking about this. They're talking about the idea that they are creating God with artificial intelligence, and that there will be, or as Joel de Rosnay said in his book, I think it was in 2000, in the Symbiotic Man, that the humans will be integrated into this new system, that kind of hive mind, where this new symbiont will effectively be the new life form. This is the same thing that Terence McKenna was suggesting as well, so it's not new. So post-humanism is an out-and-out commitment in its when we link it with technology, the technological aspect, to collective transformation. So therefore, it rejects in some ways, or some of them reject, transhumanism of the individual having the right to choose what they want to do with their body, because one of their critiques is against the Western, in particular the Western man and the individual man that wants to, they're quite explicit on that in the recent works on post-humanism in 2023. They see that as kind of an enemy in some sense. So they don't like this idea of individuality. So there's different emphasis in the school, but post-humanism has taken over in many senses from transhumanism if we look at the usage of the term. And it really reveals what the game is. So that goes back to the point that you talked about, that it really validates the idea that transhumanism was a transitionary phase and post-humanism is the goal. So at the end of post-humanism, there will be no humanism and there will be no human as we knew it. There may be something resembling it, but in my view, it cannot be anything but a slave or a part of a bigger system or a robot or an automaton. So I think that's how I'd start the picture, or delineating the picture.
Okay, well, we're going to talk about some current and future trends in society and culture and in technology, systems that define our lives in many ways on a day-to-day basis, politics, economics, etc. And these things that we've discussed before, maybe we can think about them in the light of what you've just said. You know, the difference between if it's a transhumanist thing, then these issues, they have the following relevance and they play out in these ways potentially. But what if that post-human goal, then, you know, how does that, you know, can we say more about these trends in that light? Yeah. You know, let's start, for example, with the whole, you mentioned about the body as, you know, in itself as a kind of boundary, you know, within which we're self-contained in this incarnation anyway, you know, in this realm. Dismantling boundaries just seems to be one of the big trends, taboos and other cultural boundaries, but also, you know, physical, psychological, ideological, all sorts. And one of the things at the minute is the trans mania, which everyone will be well aware of. And I think that's really key to all this, because there's a number of things that come into play there, relevant to transhumanism, as we discussed before, but particularly, you know, what is the end game? The trans mania, for me, whatever you think about the issues as it affects individuals and you know, in subgroups or whatever, zooming out for me, you're looking at, there's a discouragement for people to reproduce biologically, to, you know, to propagate the species. We have falling birth rates at the moment overall around the world. I think the global population will continue to rise for a while, but the trend is downward, particularly in developed countries, hence mass immigration, you know, to the countries, the sort of country where you and I live, you know, Western Europe, the States and whatnot, in order to prop up, you know, the economic industrial systems, which need human sort of manpower for the time being anyway. That all feeds into an overall depopulation agenda, just less humans around, because all of these prickly issues for transhumanists and posthumanists are dealt a, you know, in a positive way, dealt a positive hand by, you know, a reducing population ultimately. And the trans thing also affects just the whole idea of the family. What, you know, what that unit of the human species that's the core of everything, really. And of course, you see it in, you know, the rest of nature as well. And for me, also, this plays into, and maybe speaking myself, for myself as a white heterosexual male living in a Western country, and being of the sort of generation that I am, basically the same as yourself, where resistance might come from to these things. Saying, no, we're not doing this. You will not take apart everything that keeps our species together. And all of the trends just mentioned, they chip away at that, whether it is a kind of an idea of a physical resistance or, you know, an ideological one, a spiritual one even. For me, it seeks to undermine that.
Yeah, well, what happened, what they did very well with this, the elite class, the privileged class, the ones that had the money from empire, and they had a lot of money at the time empire finished, was they began to reconstruct the world. And we can see in the United States, you see books like Control Oligarchy, and which describes what happened with the Rockefellers and all that. But they leave out what happened in Britain and the significance of Britain. So Britain was crucial in all of this. And if we look at the descriptions of the privileged class in some of the work by Virginia Woolf, she describes the British upper class, the imperial elite, and how they knew that 9 or 10 of their children would continue on doing what they had done, and they would maintain the privilege, and that has mutated into different forms, in particular through the funding, patronage, and control of science masquerading as a general force, which it really wasn't in many senses. That the control of the development of science was to achieve and maintain governance. And they also, as we can see in the work of H.G. Wells, was to control the left and the right in the move towards global governance. And global governance was going to be based on the medical control, the control of the body. And that's why, as we speak, they're preparing to establish what they call the network in the World Health Organization, so that they can control our body directly from places like Geneva and that. Because although Victorian Britain in the 1920s was critical, in many senses, the nodal points went around the world. So Geneva became critical, particularly after the Second World War, and it's the basis of many organizations. For example, the world migration is really managed from there. Banking discussions about future currency have been going on there for a while. The World Trade Organization, which was a huge impact on national economies around the world, we go there. So there's other focuses. In relation to the issues you've talked about, I don't believe migration is to support a failing population. I've never believed that. It's quite clear from what the globalists said. There is an element of it certainly in relation to economies and to maintain a return and for rent seeking. But really, in the last few decades, it's been quite clear that there had to be a destabilization of the West, and there had to be an influx of migration in order to, I believe, stop the potential resistance to the global governance system. Because really, if we look at a lot of resistance movements or movements that gave us rights, we can go back to the Magna Carta, where the barons were taking power back from the king to the people. There's always these internal battles, or the internal battles in Britain in relation to various rights and controls. This is an ongoing thing that happened all across Europe, and I believe was fundamentally related historically to Judeo-Christian ideas of rights. And I mean, there's a huge literature and legal history that nobody ever looks at, but in relation to where these things came from. So as you're moving towards a post-human society, you can't have these rights, and you can't have human rights. So one of the aspects of the transgenderism, etc., is the deconstruction of ideas that you thought were plain to everybody. So, one discovers that one doesn't understand what a woman is anymore, and I was pretty good at recognizing that in the past. But the basic ideas are changed, and basic concepts and categories are changed through a deliberate process of deconstruction. So then people become unable to say anything which is true about things which seem obvious. And this idea is exactly what's going to happen in relation to the human. Yeah, first, it's going to relate to distinguishing between humans and machines, for example. And you will be wrong if you don't accord descriptions of consciousness to machines. You will be wrong if you're not willing to accord them rights. And if you look at Bostrom, for example, he's already complaining about potential abuse of machines in the future. And it was the first time I ever seen him really getting moved by it. So he's not concerned with humans, but he's concerned with future future automatons and their rights. We're going to have a lot of this. So the movements to change our basic ideas go together in this transitional phase. It was clear, if we go back to H.G. Wells and the objectives of the New World Order, as he describes, and the open conspiracy, was to disestablish the family, was to disestablish the nation state, and to disestablish religion. So we saw an effort recently in Ireland to disestablish the definition of a family, because family was critical in Irish history, and it's critical in relation to the conception in the treaty or in the constitution. For example, the state didn't until recently have a superior right to control the education of the children. It was the family that was given the right in the 1937 constitution. And they were steering a path between communism and fascism. They didn't want to have the state controlling the children's education. That's why the family had priority. And of course, that was informed by Catholic teaching as well, but it was informed by a deeper cultural value of the significance of the family. So once you begin to break up the family, well, then you don't have any opposition. So the family, in many senses, is what keeps the sand dunes from spreading, if you like. So it's like the marram grass and the sand dunes. And on top of that, we have the nation state. And of course, the nation state is an obstacle in the path of global governance. So as well as that, there is this idea of the medicalization of the human nature and the or the plasticity of the human body to suit new identities that are emerging all the time and in many senses are being projected onto us. The vast array of compartments about how one can describe oneself is consistent with creating a new identity where your identity is not based on your inherent human dignity. It's a movement away, and it's a deliberate movement. So post-humanism and transhumanism, in my view, is really driven by that deep state in America and in Britain as it's spread in the Western world, and all other things. The conduct of foreign policy, geopolitics, is all subject to these overriding gains. They're not accidental things that are happening. It's not accidental that Sweden is joining NATO. It's not accidental that war is happening in Ukraine. It won't be accidental when Taiwan flares up. These are all part of the plan that was laid out. We can see in the work of H.G. Wells to create global governance through massive destruction of what's there. And part of the deconstruction is the deconstruction of any fundamental element which will take it away. So it's part of a bigger thing. There's no doubt about that. Whatever about, again, adults have a right to make up their own, their own ideas about themselves. And also there is this low level transhumanism. Well, not low level. It's widespread, but it's not noticeable. Whereby the exposure to neurotoxins, to chemicals, to agents in the environment are actually changing people's physiology, so that they are becoming different, and that is an effect that has been identified through pesticides exactly. But the toleration of some of these things is also consistent with the control of the nervous system of the human body through what they call the nerves of governance, or the nerves of government at the bigger scale. So yes, that's a part of the general deconstruction, and deconstruction that we see also associated with techniques of postmodernism are fundamentally at the base of posthumanism, because postmodernism and posthumanism are very, very closely connected. And posthumanism is more specifically directed towards the goal of human transformation.
Well, this medicalization of everything we saw, of course, come into laser-like focus during the COVID phase, whatever you think that was, and we've seen a wider trend of like social problems being identified as biological in whatever sense. In COVID, it was all about and this has continued on since, this increasing trends of like collecting medical data and interventions for everything. And then there's that whole sort of echoes of horrors of the past, these ideas of like cleansing and hygiene. Remember the
Yes.
COVID, all that sort of, all the hand washing and all the wiping down of surfaces and everything else. And that, of course, is all repudiating the biological, the human, the dirt, the grit of physical, biological reality.
Yes.
And then we talk about cleansing and hygiene is beyond the physical dimension. Then you're into the realm of the mind, of psychology, and even, of like sort of ideas and concepts. So all of that has become, it was there beforehand, of course, but I think since COVID, on all the different levels I mentioned, you've seen that becoming ever more pervasive. That's an important part again, because it has this, as much as it's set out as supporting biological life, this is a good thing, isn't it? Because it's, as modern medicine, look at all the wonders thereof. Ultimately, it's crossed over into kind of stamping it out, erasing it. To the idea of like, oh well, who would want to who would want to have sex to reproduce to have a baby? It's really icky. There's fluids, there's discharges, it's all needs to be like it all needs to be cleaned away.
Yeah, that's a very important point. Now, if we remember that the idea behind the New World Order is specifically about control by a scientific elite, and specifically through biodirectorates, through health. So this is the mode of governance. And that's specifically related to the idea that the human was going to be changed. And that we can see clearly in Bernal's work, as we've talked about, that you're going to be changed into something silicon, part of a network, that we're going to have ectogenesis. So some of the arguments in favor of this population thing, or we need to increase our population now, will be merely an argument in favor of producing babies in, outside the womb. This is what's going to happen. I mean, I'm pretty sure we'll hear a lot more of that. Paradoxically, and here is where you can see the lie of it. Paradoxically, where many humanists are advocating euthanasia. So I hear the argument coming from many humanists about how dignified it is and how important, and I know people that have taken cases, lawyers, for their right, and I understand the particular context, but in all of these contexts, what happens is the exception is used to become the rule. So you take an exceptional case, and after a while very, very quickly, it's intended to become the rule. So that's why we have in Europe, in places like Holland and Belgium, we have children who now can have euthanasia. If you're depressed, you can get euthanasia. According to studies in Holland, that the voluntariness of the euthanasia is not an accurate description of the process that happens. If you're economically dependent or invalided, you may be offered euthanasia in Canada as well. This is part of the policy. So immediately you see with this death cult, which is there, and which is obviously, if you take the extension of euthanasia, extension of abortion after birth, which sounds incredible, but which Philip K. Dick predicted, then that's utterly inconsistent with the idea of the preservation and extension of life as a value per se. So it's not about that. It's not about the idea of some commitment to life. It's about the eugenesis control of biology so that they can be made compliant with the wishes of the elite. I got an email about Matthew Desmet and an article he wrote about the Suicide Society this year, and a number of people were impressed with it. 100 years ago, Winston Churchill wrote an essay, "Shall We All Commit Suicide?" So they were thinking in the 20s very, very clearly about this. And that was one of the reasons when they understood the atomic bomb, etc., and what science could do and the forces that they had unleashed, they realized they wouldn't be able to control them. And this was part of the idea that they shifted the British Empire in particular, with all the genius of its capabilities and the scientific wealth available to it, shifted towards the control of the mind, the long-term ambition to control the human at the genetic level, at the psychological level, at the political level, through mechanization and interference mechanically with the body until they were transformed into a new species or a new automaton under the control. Now, if you think of this, the dirt element, in nearly all the religious traditions and spiritual traditions, the human is made from dirt or dust, and they're put together and they return to dust. And what's put into them is this spirit which defines which distinguishes them from dirt. And as you've suggested, and there is interesting writing about this also from a left-wing perspective about the growth of this ideology of hygienism, which is an overpowering ideology associated with this medicalization that people like Ivan Illich anticipated. And at the same time, one of the interventions in the last few decades in the politics was the arrival of the Green movement. Now, if you think about the Green movement, initially, before I knew anything about it, and I began to investigate and change my mind very, very quickly, but I assumed that this was going to be a good thing in the first couple of years when I heard about it. I assumed that people wanted in some way to protect nature, and that's implicit in the word green. Now, if you take one of the countries that was acknowledged to be one of the most greenest countries in the world, which is Ireland, the green movement is leading to it being covered with black mechanical things and solar panels and lovely green fields. It's leading to it being covered with huge windmills made of metal and industrial scale that we never had in Ireland that cover the lovely green grass. What's green about it? There's nothing green about it. The green movement in many senses is a misdescription, because really what it's about is a movement towards the technosphere based on electricity and the control of electricity. So electricity is a crucial element of this, and the control of the human as an electromagnetic being or capable of being interfered with through the spectrum. And this goes back to just mention one context, give an example of where these ideas come from. When Mesmer was investigated for his animal magnetism and the idea that there was some kind of electricity in the body, which later was explored in the 18th century by Galvani and others, applying electricity to the body, they began to understand that you could control the human body through external forms and and also the mind. And he was investigated in Paris, and one of the people on the commission was Benjamin Franklin. And Benjamin Franklin, of course, we know as a great political philosopher, signed all the major documents in the United States, ambassador to France, investigates electricity, lives in London, printer, published pamphlets. Interestingly, when they were changing his house in London into a museum in the 90s, they discovered something like 1,200 pieces of human bones in the house, because they had an anatomy school in that place. So you see this connection between political ideas, political philosophy, control of the body, particularly using electricity, control of the mind. It's there. It's the basis of Frankenstein. They understood that the comprehension of these systems would lead to the ability to control the human mind. And instead of having an idea of the human in the future living in a pristine environment, the idea was, we'll change the environment, we'll create this technosphere. All of these movements that claim that they want to protect nature, in my argument, is largely spurious. It's part of this industrialization process. I went out this morning. It was a lovely morning here. I never seen so many trails in the sky, in zigzags, in X's, in squares, and they're telling us that this is a conspiracy theory. A week or so ago, after the rains in Dubai and that, the Daily Mail suddenly reveals that 50 countries are practicing geoengineering. Bill Gates wanted to start in Sweden with his plan to have a sunscreen around the earth and to do tests. We're not going to hear about these things because of secrecy, but they're certainly doing things. There's a whole range of possibilities what they're doing. All of these things show that they're going to change the extended phenotype, the environment, so that we will have to adapt to it. And the human, as we know it, won't even be able to function because they're dependent on these systems. And we may not even be able to live in the environment that they intend to create. And it's crystal clear that they're willing to interfere in complex systems by fools that don't know what they are. What authority, scientific authority, does Bill Gates have to drive forward a plan to interfere with a system that has grown over millions of years? It's incredible, the stupidity. And I think people have to stop bowing down between this. So we're moving to a post-biological phase, and all of this medicalization is consistent with the idea that we're plastic, we're something else. Our identity is not spiritual. Our identity is not consistent with, say, the dignity of a person who in some ways are a reflection of a divine force or consciousness which is fundamental. Yeah.
One of the trends I noticed in the drive to kind of devalue and reduce the status of the natural you've just been talking about and the human is putting us into the sort of subcategories that if you can't laugh about this, you have to laugh about this rather, should I say, otherwise you'd cry, into these sort of subcategories, and the stuff that we see as just obsessive mania that we then get our own little category of that to be part of. And when I was reading your book, it reminded me of something that I'd read a few days prior, an article where someone like myself, and presumably you, and many people listening to this, were now categorized as non-trans, if you see what I mean. So it's not like we're, the previous ways we might have been categorized on forms that we had to fill in or boxes that we had to tick on websites, for your preferences or how you see yourself. Now I apparently am non-trans. And then this other thing about being cisgendered. So I can't be a human. I can't be, an adult male. I can't be heterosexual. I have to be a cis non-trans. And I can't remember exactly what the reference was in your book, whereabouts this cropped up. But there was this portrait of an individual, a problematic individual, in this post-humanist context. And it was white, cisgendered, able-bodied, in control, reliant on no one. And I thought, well, yeah, of course. I mean, that's exactly those are all the boxes I would tick, if not like already would like to be. I am white. That's whatever. That's got nothing to do with anything. It's just a fact of genetics. I could be green, yellow, whatever. It doesn't matter. It is what it is. Cisgendered. Well, that's fine. I don't. That's not an issue of identity for me. It's just a biological fact. Able-bodied. Well, who wouldn't want to be that? In control. Who wouldn't want to be that? However you see it. Reliant on no one. Well, no man's an island, but self-reliance is a good thing. So I think this is all very positive ultimately, in my interpretation. But no, I'm just a cis non-trans. So you get sucked into that world of pronouns and categories and subcategories, and ultimately that takes you further and further away from the physical reality. Biological reality has previously been categorized. So it's almost like if you you can see this happening in many areas of life. You rebrand something and it can become something new. You see this with field products. So we'll call it this, or political systems or economic systems, whatever it happens to be, or even just, a company. It's like, it didn't work, so we'll call it something else. And people go, oh, it isn't that previous failed thing. It's this new thing. Or it isn't that previously successful thing. It's now, these people are just non-trans now, so that we're all down in the same gutter, going down the same drain. That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com